Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Mark Miller, and this is Miller Public Relations. It's Tuesday, so it's time for another video. And this week, we're going to talk about something that folks ask me about all the time. They're always very interested in, and that's crisis communications. So I'm going to break down three real quick things today. And so those three things will be how to establish a process before a crisis occurs to be ready for a crisis. Number two, when a crisis does occur, how do you react in your communications, and how do you deal with that? And then three, after a crisis or in a longer crisis, when there's a break, what do you do at that time, and how do you look back over what's just occurred? So we'll hit those three things today. So let's go ahead and get started. Establishing a process before a crisis occurs. How do you do that? Well, first you're going to establish roles and responsibilities and make sure that's all written down, that everyone understands, is it my job to collect information? Is it my job to consolidate information? Maybe it's my job to take a cut sheet and be ready to speak to the media, or be ready to reach out to journalists, write a press release, or do a video like the one I'm doing right now. Those are all different roles and responsibilities within a team or an organization that folks might be assigned in your crisis communication process. Also, determine what your core messaging is. Last week, I did a video on communications planning and talked a lot about, planning out what to say to your key audience and how that supports your organizational goals. No different in crisis communication. When you find yourself in a crisis, you want to be able to go back to that core messaging and say, hey, these are the most important things I want my key audiences to understand, no matter what the crisis is. So these are things you can establish ahead of time before you find yourself in a crisis. Talk to your team and train your employees so that they understand this process that you've established. You can write up a great process all day long, but when you throw it in a drawer and no one sees it, that might help you when then you're faced with a crisis, but the rest of your team won't be aware of it. So take the time to talk with your team, talk with your employees, and do that training so that folks are ready, that if and when something does go wrong, everyone's prepared and they know what their role is. One thing not to include in a crisis communications process that you're trying to map out and have written down, don't attempt to plan or direct where the questions are coming from or who journalists will contact, because they will contact who they're able to find. They'll contact you or your team by email, telephone. They might try to catch folks in the parking lot. So that's one thing that really can't be controlled. That could just throw a wrench in your plan if you're trying to dictate where those questions or where the narrative might come from. So that's establishing the process before a crisis. What do we do when a crisis actually occurs? Well, that's when we have to think about speed, transparency, and accuracy. So speed is important because if you don't get out there in front of the cameras, or if you don't get out there on social media, whatever it might be, or with a press release, the story will start to take its own shape. The media or the journalists or folks at home out there on social media, whatever it may be, folks are going to start drawing their own conclusions, building their own story without your context if you don't get some messaging out there quickly. So that's why speed is so important. But accuracy is also important. So there's a balance between those two. So if you're trying to disclose the maximum amount of information in the minimum amount of time, take into consideration that maybe it's better to address the public with what you do know very quickly, and then let them know, hey, I'm going to get back with you with more details as this unfolds. We're trying to get all the facts in order ourselves here. That's okay to admit. Transparency is also very important. When you're covering things up or trying to hold cards very close to your chest, that comes across in your communications, and people catch on to that very fast. So be transparent. Admit if something's gone wrong. Admit if you don't have all the answers. That's okay, and folks understand that. But be transparent about it. Don't try to cover things up, because the questions that come in after that often uncover that very quickly. Always remember to be respectful and with your audience, of course, because those are your stakeholders, and also with journalists. Respect and authenticity goes a long way to your external publics having maybe a bit more empathy for you and for your organization. Lastly, number 3, what to do after a crisis or a break in the crisis if this is a longer scenario. You want to assess your lessons learned. Go back and say, yeah, that didn't go so well. Here's how we could improve on that next time. Or conversely, hey, we did this really, really well, and we want to make sure that that's exactly how we do it in the future. Go back and take note of those things. Take note of what the response was from your key stakeholders. That's very important as well. They're probably giving you some feedback. Take that feedback and then go back and adjust your plan or process as necessary. Make those changes, and then we start the loop over again. You're back at establishing a process or a plan before the crisis, and now you're talking to your team and training your employees with those lessons learned and with that feedback that you had before. So in conclusion, those are our 3 steps again. Establish a process before a crisis occurs. When a crisis does occur, remember your speed, transparency, and accuracy, as well as your audience consideration. And lastly, when the crisis is over, don't forget to go back and look at your lessons learned and incorporate those for next time. If you need help establishing your crisis communications process, or if you'd like someone to come in and do training with your staff and your employees, I'm available to do that. Check out the other services I provide, as well as crisis communications process, at markmillerpr.com. That web address is on your screen. Again, that's www.markmillerpr.com. Thanks so much and have a great day, everyone.